The theme of regret is one of the more prominent themes throughout The Walking Dead, as our characters inhabit a world where survival is often prioritised over morality, meaning they frequently are forced into impossible decisions that will often haunt them later down the line. In today's video, I wanted to delve into the very concept of regret and go over some of the main characters' biggest mishaps to find out what is the biggest regret of each of our survivors. So let's get into the video. Now, let's start off with everyone's favourite police officer turned survival expert, Rick Grimes. With Rick being a leader, it means he has far more responsibilities than most other characters on this list, which in turn probably means he lives with more regret. For Rick, there are a couple of options here. Firstly, there's the death of his wife Lori. The two's relationship had been strained since he discovered Lori's affair with Shane, and Rick never had the chance to fully reconcile with her. Her death left him feeling responsible for not only not protecting her, but also for the unresolved tension between the two of them. Another strong contender for Rick's biggest regret would probably be the circumstances that led up to Shane's death. While he knew Shane had become a threat, Shane was his best friend and a father figure towards Carl in Rick's absence. The betrayal and the loss of that bond we know still haunts Rick to this very day, demonstrated perfectly by Rick's hallucinations of Shane some 9 years after his death. But whilst the loss of his wife and his best friend are no doubt strong contenders here, I think Rick's biggest regret is attacking that Savior outpost. The attack on the Savior outpost was a preemptive strike orchestrated by Rick to protect the group and eliminate what he saw as a potential threat. But it kind of did the exact opposite. Not only did this attack trigger a brutal war, resulting in a ton of casualties on both sides, but it also directly resulted in the deaths of Glenn, Abraham, Sasha, Denise, Olivia, and Shiva, that poor tiger. But the Savior War also indirectly killed Carl. And although his death wasn't directly caused by the Saviors themselves, it was the chain of events stemmed from the ongoing conflict that resulted in his death. Rick's main driving force throughout the series was the safety of his son Carl. And with him now dead, Rick went into a pretty dark place for a period of time. The apocalypse stripped away pretty much everything Rick loved, but Carl was always that one constant throughout the show that gave him a sense of stability and motivation. On top of this, the deaths of Glenn and Abraham, who were part of his post-apocalyptic family, left Rick crushed. This was one of the few times in the series where Rick was truly broken, and for a long time he carried an immense amount of guilt over the death of these two characters. And that scene where he breaks down to Michonne about Glenn's death is not only soul-destroying, but it also tells us everything we need to know. Like I said earlier, there are lots of decisions that could have been here. Not being able to save Herschel, and Lori and Shane's death are definitely up there, but it's this attack on the outpost which I believe is Rick Grimes' biggest regret. And like a cruel trick from the higher powers above, it took the death of his own son to finally realise the attack on the outpost that night was the wrong decision. Next up, we have Daryl Dixon. Now there is one very obvious answer here, but this call is a lot closer than you probably would all think. Daryl's right hook at Negan is the obvious answer. But a very strong argument can be made for Daryl taking Maggie's side and leading Rick away, obviously resulting in Rick's disappearance and presumed death by most of our survivors. But Daryl, most likely consumed by guilt, has been searching for Rick for over 6 years. And although we as the audience all know that Rick is alive and well, Daryl doesn't. So in the current timeline, Rick might as well be dead to him, just like Glenn is from The Punch. And with Daryl's inability to find any sign of Rick after the accident, it only proves to us the immense guilt he feels for how that day unfolded. And on top of this, he almost punishes himself by living in isolation. So yeah, it basically comes down to a toss-up between these two situations. There is also the death of his biological brother Merle, and despite their complicated and often toxic relationship, Merle was Daryl's only family for much of his life, so I'm sure he wishes he was able to save him from his self-destructive path. But that being said, there's not much Daryl could have really done to stop Merle's death, so for me, it's between Rick's disappearance and Glenn's death, which is Daryl's biggest regret. And I think it would be Glenn's death that just edges out Rick's disappearance, although they are both like brothers to Daryl. Glenn's death was a direct result of Daryl's impulsive actions, making it feel deeply personal for Daryl as he knows his emotional outburst triggered it. He carries the weight of feeling directly responsible for his friend's gruesome death and the pain it caused, especially to Maggie. Whereas Rick's presumed death was the result of a series of unfortunate events, including the Walker herd and Rick's injury. While Daryl blames himself for distracting Rick during their argument, the circumstances were largely out of Daryl's control. I mean, he even hit some insane crossbow shots in an attempt to save Rick. So, unlike Glenn's death where Daryl's direct actions led to the outcome, Rick's disappearance was not something Daryl intentionally caused, making the guilt less intense for the character. So for me, that's why Glenn's death beats out Rick's disappearance in Daryl Dixon's biggest regret. Now, unlike most of you might predict, Negan's biggest regret is certainly not killing Glenn and Abraham. And we know this for sure as the character says it himself to Maggie in season 11. In fact, I think his biggest regret from that situation, again as stated by the character, would be the fact that he didn't kill all of them that night at the lineup, as Negan probably would have never been overthrown, and he would still be the same Negan we saw in season 7 with all the power and resources at his feet. However, I think Negan's biggest regret is pretty unique in terms of this list anyway, and no, it's not the fact that he slept with Alpha in one of the most disturbing scenes in the whole show, as Negan's biggest regret probably comes pre-apocalypse, and that would be cheating on his wife Lucille. Negan loved Lucille, and he even named his iconic weapon after her as a way to keep her memory alive. And he struggles immensely with the guilt of failing her emotionally during her illness as well as being unfaithful before her diagnosis. An argument could be made his biggest regret would be getting high with Lucille that night, and forgetting to turn the generator back on, resulting in her chemotherapy treatment going bad, which in turn led to her taking her own life. But that's not only kind of what Lucille wanted, but they also had one last night together on their anniversary where for the first time in a long time, Lucille didn't feel any physical pain. So for me here, the choice is still Negan cheating on Lucille. Despite his mistakes, Negan genuinely loved Lucille. She was grounding and a meaningful figure in his life, and when he cheated on her, he shattered a bond that was central to his identity, and it left him with a deep sense of guilt. I also think that guilt ate away at him for years and still haunts him to this day. So for me, Negan Smith's biggest regret is cheating on his wife. Carol's a character who lives with a lot of guilt. Not only has every single one of her biological and adopted children died in the apocalypse, but she's also had to make some flat out harrowing decisions. Firstly, Sophia's death particularly haunts her, as she regrets not being able to protect Sophia from the horrors of the new world, and this failure to protect her daughter becomes a catalyst for her transformation into the survivor she becomes. Other shouts are killing Karen and David at the prison, not being able to prevent Henry's death, and the infamous killing of Lizzie. Because although Carol knew it was absolutely necessary to protect the group, especially baby Judith, killing Lizzie, a child who she also cared about, left her with profound guilt, changing her character forever. But for me, the edge still has to go to Sophia's death. As we see in Daryl Dixon, this death still haunts her years into the apocalypse, and it's her biological child. Sophia was Carol's primary source of love and hope, as she endured years of abuse from her husband Ed, and much of her strength came from her role as a mother and the desire to protect Sophia. Losing her shattered Carol's world, and her death wasn't just the loss of her child, but also the loss of her primary reason to keep going. And although she does manage to find a new purpose to survive, this is, with no doubt, Carol's biggest regret, not being able to protect her daughter. But with that being said, that wraps up today's video. I would just like to say a huge thank you for watching, and sorry for the lower quality video as I'm editing on my phone and don't have access to my PC. It will be back to normal next week, I promise. If you guys want me to delve into some more characters' biggest regrets, please do let me know down below in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed. But again, thank you for watching, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.